Welcome back, Davengerinos, West Coast Davengerinos. I'm presenting to you another great chat today, and we have with us a legend, somebody who's been in the comic industry for over 4 decades, Bob Hall. Uh, so much in the bibliography, but co-creator of the West Coast Avengers. Whoa, I just said that. That's a Freudian slip. Co-creator of the West Coast Avengers and some of the greatest graphic novels of all time, including Emperor Doom and Squadron Supreme. Jumping over to DC, doing some of the great Joker stories, I Joker and Joker Time, as well as Valiant with a huge Shadow Man run and Armed and Dangerous, as well as a playwright and a theater director, Bob Hall. Oh no, Bob Hall, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you? And
I'm doing
I'm
great.
amazed. Who is this person you've described?
Well, it's interesting. I just had a chat with Mark Wade a couple weeks ago, who I also met at SummerCon, and I said to him, I said, you can't actually go through your entire bibliography because it would be 45 minutes just doing that.
Yep.
And when you hear it out like that, it does kind of sound like it's intimidating, I'm sure, on both sides.
A many years ago, actually, I went to a panel discussion by artistic directors of regional theaters, and
Mhm.
there's something about the nature of the ego in theater that they asked them all to introduce themselves. And by the time they had gotten done introducing themselves, all the time for the panel was gone.
I mean, it can be in a lot of work just to go through somebody's body of work verbally.
Hmm.
Um, I do want to ask. I mean, I know you went to school for theater. What was your growing up? Before we get into comics, just was there a fascination with theater early on?
No, uh, I there was a fascination with storytelling. Um, it was something I knew. I was looking for where did I belong,
Hmm.
and I'd always loved comics when I was a kid. But then in it was 1958. I was real specific, and um, it was a life changing year for me because Universal International released all of their black and white horror films to TV for the first time, including Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, which I think is the greatest gothic horror movie ever filmed, and all these Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, the Wolfman, the Mummy, all of
Yeah.
the Dracula, all of those great things. Hammer Films released The Horror of Dracula, uh, probably their best film, and
Hmm.
uh, Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine came out. And I was so taken with these things, I wanted to figure out what could I do with it. And there was a guy named Basil Gagos. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. Gagos. I don't know. Having not never met him, I wish I had. Who was a wonderful painter who did all of these covers for Famous Monsters of Filmland. So I started imitating him and even learning to do makeup and stuff. And I thought maybe that was where I belonged. But then I got to high school, and we would a couple of things happened. We would do a session learning Shakespeare where the idea was that you would read until you made an error. And I had gone. My folks had sent me to church. Now my folks never went to church, but they thought I should go, and so they sent me to this church right across the street. Very friendly, nice people. They were evangelists, but in the old Billy Graham sense rather than the current despicable sense.
Yeah.
And I very quickly somehow all of all of everything I learned there led me to become an agnostic. but uh,
I
but
feel.
one of the things that was really great was we had to memorize all these Bible verses and say them out loud.
Hmm.
Well, that's Shakespearean language. That was the King James version of the Bible. That's the same period as Shakespeare was writing. And I got to high school, and we did one of those read downs, and I found that I could absolutely read Shakespeare out loud. And
Oh,
I was astonished. And so was everybody else. and and a speech teacher there said, you should do something, go to the speech contest. And you do this. It was debate and drama. But wait, I did one of those terrible things where you played two parts from a play, and you played both parts, and you positioned one over here and one over here, and tried to do two funny voices. And but that got me into theater. It also got me into speech therapy because I did not receive a superior. I only got an excellent from the
oh,
judges. And I thought, what did I do wrong? She said, maybe you should listen to yourself. And I still can remember, I'll read you the lines because what I heard was from Inherit the Wind.
hmm
Your Honor, the prosecution has brought to Hillsborough at great expense and inconvenience 16 noted scientists. Now, you can't pick a worse speech than that to find out that you had a lisp.
yeah.
And the interesting thing was that I didn't hear it. I seemed to me, I was speaking perfectly normally. And so I had to take all kinds of speech therapy and stuff. But she got me into theater, and she sent me down to the university to participate in their summer teenage high school program. And I got leads in the plays. And that was, I had never knew where I belonged. And all of a sudden I was accepted someplace.
Yeah.
And so that was just great. But in the long run, everything I've just described is storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah.
So am I a comic book artist? Am I a theater person? Yes, but basically I'm a storyteller.
And that's the beautiful thing about, well, both of those things, but comics, the the script is shared equal with the art, because the art
Mhm.
is just as much storytelling as the script, because you can put a bunch of words on paper, but unless somebody draws it, you just have a book.
And if you do it right, they interact with each other.
Yes, yes, and that was one of the things that I really, liked hearing about from Mark, because Mark's a writer and not an artist, and you're both. I mean, you're both.
Well, Wade understands that. There are writers who don't understand that,
Mhm.
and if they don't, sometimes their writing is very redundant. So they will be describing what goes on in the pictures. Almost nobody writes captions anymore. Thank God for caption boxes, because it used to be that with especially back in when I was a kid, there would be a caption that said Batman goes into the dark cellar in the and then of course the artist would show Batman going into the dark cellar.
Yeah, very
and
ridiculous.
so, and so but the writer wasn't sure what the artist was going to really draw.
Mhm.
And uh, and could he depend on the artist to tell the story? And of course that was Stan's, whether it was accidental or on purpose, who knows. But when Stan started doing the Marvel method and absolutely depended on the artist,
Yeah.
it opened up a whole new look for comics. So
Which continued to evolve to this day. I do want to roll it back quick, because I know you have an interesting origin story with comics, and I've heard it, but I would love for people to hear it. But I have a question on top of that, because I haven't. I'll wait until the right moment. But you were in the hospital, right?
that thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got very ill when I was 4 years old, and
Mhm.
my folks were terrified. I was vomiting blood,
Oof.
and I mean that will terrify you if you're a parent, surely. And
Yeah.
so of course they took me to the emergency room, and they didn't know what was wrong with me. They couldn't figure it out. And the strange thing was that after I got through this, I didn't vomit anymore, and
Mhm.
I felt fine. But they did, they ran the test, temperature, and all that kind of stuff. Said, no, you're still ill. I mean,
Mhm.
they didn't talk to me. I was a kid. Nobody talks to kids in a hospital. But I was so active, I didn't want to be in the bed and stuff like that. So they kept bringing me stuff to mollify me. And one thing they brought me was comic books, and I couldn't quite read yet. I could
Yeah.
sound out a few things, but but they're comics, so I could look at the pictures and suss out the story.
Yeah.
And they were wonderful because, first of all, some of them were Disney's. Like I got Carl Barks's very first comic book was called Pirate Gold.
Yeah.
And that was one of them. And it was an old beat up copy of that of the first printing of that comic, which I think was just, wow. But then there was other stuff that a 4-year-old shouldn't be reading, all kinds of EC stuff. And so I got the whole shebang there. And I was there for, I don't know how long. To me, it seemed like a week, but I'm guessing more like 3 days or something. And they still couldn't figure it out. And they were going to do more tests. My folks said they were maybe going to do an exploratory, which sounds reasonably terrible. They didn't tell me that, of course, but I found that later on. And I'm not sure that may have evolved. Maybe they were and maybe they weren't, but they were definitely going to do more tests. And they had me read. They were prepping me for the tests. And the nurse noticed me scratching behind my ear. And she looked and she said, "Oh my God." And she ran and got the doctor. And the doctor came and he looked behind the ear and he said, "You have measles." And what I had was intestinal measles. They just never came out.
Yeah.
And as happens with measles, if anybody has ever had them, people don't have them anymore.
Right.
By the way, all you people who don't believe vaccinations work, we have almost eradicated measles, by the way.
Yeah. Polio, measles, these things do get eradicated by vaccines.
Yeah. So we won't get into that, but I just throw that in for what it's worth.
Yeah.
And so the doctor said, "That's great. You have measles. You're going to be fine. We can send you home, and you have to leave immediately because measles are the most contagious disease going." Yeah. And by the way, all those comic books, you have to take them with you. Right. By that time, I'd accumulated a shopping bag full of them. So that was my introduction to comics, and also was a real impulse. I mean, the next day I started first grade, and I had all these comics I wanted to be able to read, and so while I found Dick and Jane very boring, I very quickly developed the skill. And man, after you'd read comics, then all the next summer, I was years ahead of a lot of other people in the class in terms of reading. It was wonderful. For those of you who out there who are wondering if your kids should read comics, you want them to read, give them comic books.
Yeah. There's proof on both sides of this right now. I mean, if it wasn't for comics, I wouldn't be doing this. And if it wasn't for comics, you wouldn't have gotten into comics. And that kind of brings my next question is, well, the EC kind of makes sense because you talked already about you like the horror movies. You went into, but do you remember your first experience with buying comics after that? Like what you were reading after you were, after you got that taste? What did you gravitate towards?
Well, my folks had already been buying me comics, and they knew I couldn't quite read yet, but they thought that something a little bit less sophisticated. Little did they know. So they were buying me Donald Ducks. Donald Ducks were not the least sophisticated comics being produced. They were probably the most sophisticated comic books being done, since I consider Carl Barks one of the 3 or 4 great geniuses of comic books, and probably produced the best adventure stories for kids in comics ever. Just astonishing, and you go back, and it was so wonderful when Gladstone did the reprints, and I picked up a whole bunch of them and read them and said, "Oh my God, these are just as good as I thought." No, in fact, they're better, because now I'm getting all this stuff that he threw in that you didn't get. So those, and I would say they were my major influence. Now, I did like Batman. I liked just about anything I picked up. I loved Batman, Superman, but especially Captain Marvel. I mean, the real Captain Marvel. Not these fakey Captain Marvels that Marvel's producing, but Fawcett's the guy they call Shazam, but he's not Shazam. He's Captain Marvel, the big red cheese, and he was so much fun. I loved him. And then, of course, this was the era of Westerns. So there were all of these Western comics that were out there. and I loved Roy Rogers comics. And I say those specifically because years and years later, my mentor of getting into comics was John Buscema.
Mm-hmm.
And what was John Buscema drawing in the 50s? Roy Rogers.
Yeah.
And so my idols were the right people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also Joe Kubert. I remember becoming acquainted with Joe Kubert when 3D comics came out, and he did Tor in 3D. And
I just came across that the other day.
And it's one of those things that people whose style was so distinctive that you may not have known the name, but when you finally got into comics, you're saying, "Oh yeah, I read this guy back in the 50s. I read him in the 60s, or whatever." So lots of the best stuff. There was also a lot of, really almost dismally badly drawn comics going on. But even that was encouraging, because I sort of felt, gee, I can be that mediocre. I can do that.
Well, you just named three people: Barks, Kubert, and Big John Buscema. If you took all of their work and just piled it in a pile, comic book wise, you're talking about a mountain of work.
You're talking the kind of mountain of work that people were burning during the Dr. Wortham days.
Yeah.
The other guy like that was, of course, Kirby.
Yes.
And Kirby was when I was a kid, Kirby was in one of his declines in terms of getting work, and he was going around from this company to that company. Apparently, Jim Shooter, who knows about these things more than I do, said that DC had decided that Kirby was too, quote, crude for them. He wasn't the same kind of draftsmanship they were used to.
Right.
Because he was developing more and more, that final Kirby style that was almost cubist.
Mm-hmm.
But he did come up with I was right in the pocket in my youth to get Fighting American and Boys Ranch, which were masterpieces. Didn't last long, but they were wonderful. And then I would go to there was a local Salvation Army store where I could buy comics from the 40s.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to talk about whatever happened to them, mothers and burning piles and things like that. We won't discuss, because I could buy these for 2 cents a piece and come home with 2 shopping bags full of 1940s comic books. And again, I got acquainted with Kirby. I think it was not the Newsboy Legion, the other one. He did 2 of them that were
wasn't Boy Commandos.
Boy Commandos.
Boy Commandos. Okay,
that's right, Boy Commandos. And then I would notice other things that he had done, like he would be doing a little bit of everything. There was something called Real Fact Comics, where I'm sure it was him that drew the story of Harry Houdini. And,
wow.
And you just knew that there was everybody else, and then there was this other guy that did these things that were so dramatic.
Yeah,
that
like you said, cubist. I mean, his shapes and the Kirby Crackle, obviously, it's so unique. Even to this day, like you can see some people that take from it, but there's nobody that naturally did anything like Kirby.
Yeah, I saw Neil Adams did a poster for, I think it was Terrific Con, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
It was a reproduction of the John Buscema cover, the one of Thor and the Silver Surfer.
Yeah.
It's just one of the masterpieces, and I can understand why Neil would want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I would be if somebody said to me, "Would you want to?" I would say, "Yeah, it's a little intimidating, but I would give it a try." It was just an interesting comparison. John was the person other than Kirby who could do go off into, I don't know what you would call it, a kind of fantasy world
Hmm.
where featuring gods, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
on that level. And Neil, the comparison, you compare the two and you say, gee, Neil is probably one of the, I would include him right there with Barks as of best comic books that ever lived.
Hmm.
Couldn't bring that one off.
Yeah.
John could bring that, and Kirby could bring that off. And there aren't that many people who can make that. A lot of stuff happens in outer space anymore, and
Hmm.
it's in comics, but it's not quite the same. There's something about those guys that were able to go out there, and you felt that they lived out there somewhere in some galaxy. They would go visit and come back with drawings.
Where you feel more about Neil Adams that he lived in Crime Alley, like he was down there on
Mm-hmm.
the streets, and it makes sense, where he ended up, and it's kind of the same way with Frank Miller. You feel like Frank Miller's been living in the worst alley, in New York City for 50 years.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I do want to ask about that, the New York, you moving to New York, but you went to, it was the Americana Hotel, I think, and John Buscema was having like a portfolio review. How did you find out about that?
There was a small ad in the back of Marvel Comics.
Huh.
I'm sure they gave him the space.
Yeah.
And I don't know this for sure, but I think that what had happened was that Stan was trying to get, and from conversations with John
Hmm.
that I had in the long, eventually, once I was not too shy to be able to talk to him more as a friend than as an in-awe student,
Right.
that Stan had wanted him to do a book. And Stan wanted to do a book, how to do Marvel Comics. And it became How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. And John basically had to write it. I mean, people, you and I know, and the people who probably watch this podcast know that Stan can't draw at all.
Yeah.
But a lot of people think that Stan, actually drew these things. And John felt, without teaching a class, I mean, he'd been in the business since the 1950s,
Hmm.
and he'd sort of, what am I doing? What would I tell somebody? I took some art classes way back when, but it's been years, and I need to. If I teach, I'll know what to put in the book.
Sure.
And so I think that's how that evolved, and he decided to teach, and I think he enjoyed it.
Hmm.
And you auditioned with a portfolio, and I got in. I had and I fit the profile of who John was hoping with taking the class. I was a little earlier, a little older. I was in my late 20s, and I had been drawing. I can't say that I was great, but I'd been drawing for a long time. And I put myself through school doing posters and program covers and worked for the theater department. I was usually the staff artist.
Yeah.
And also took a lot of scenery design and costume design. And so I'd been drawing. And John told me that he had thought that who would take the class, because it was the kind of people who had been breaking into comics in the 50s and 60s, were people who comics was a pass-through. You were on your way to being either a lot of the people who really liked storytelling wanted to be doing a daily strip.
Yeah.
Which paid at that time a lot more, if you could get one, than comics did. Or they wanted to go on to be illustrators or commercial artists.
Yeah.
Because part of this was that comics were considered sort of the butt end of the illustration field, and also the pay was awful in comics in the 50s and 60s and in the 70s when I got into it. The pay was just, but you worked so hard to get into it, and you did a portfolio, and then you found out you were only getting, I think the rate was something like $28 a page, and starting with, and you were, now that was to encourage you. First of all, they just didn't want to pay you anymore, but it also encouraged you to do a lot of work, which was the idea. Nobody really cared whether it was that good. They just wanted it done and do a lot of it. And that's how what you had to learn to do to make a living back then. Anyway, so I fit this kind of profile of, he was figuring, a person who's had art experience, but who wants to learn storytelling and sequential art, and also just how to draw superheroes, and how to draw action. What John got was fans. Mm-hmm. It was a class full of fans. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It was that point at which the comic book industry was going to change within the next few years to being all of these guys who had been, some of them since the 40s, doing it. The fans were going to run it.
Yes.
And so that was okay, but it left me in the position of being the guy that John chose to. I think John wanted somebody from this class to get a job at Marvel, or maybe I'm just being humble. Maybe he really liked my work, but anyway, he got me the job at Marvel. So that's how I got into the business.
And I mean, when you think about it, and from what I understand, fans couldn't really exist for the artist in the 40s and 50s because nobody was credited. It wasn't until the early 60s, right, that people started being credited.
That's right. So that Carl Barks was known as the good duck man.
Yeah.
You open it and you could say, do I want this comic? Yeah, he's doing it. Mm-hmm. But Dell never credited anybody. There were some, Bob Kane was the exception.
Right.
And he made the deal. He had always had to say by Bob Kane.
Even though we know now that most of that wasn't even true.
Mercifully. It wasn't true.
But a guy like Schomburg, people didn't know who Alex Schomburg was back then because there was no way he was getting his name on some of that stuff. And so when you look at it, the early 60s, you start seeing the credits. And one guy that I always recognized would always sign his work. And they would try and cut it out. Wrightson. Bernie always signed his work. Pages, covers, everything. Mm-hmm. His name was all over it.
There were people that somehow did get identified. I remember just as I was starting to not read comics anymore, because that was the idea of if you're my age, you were expected to stop reading comic books at about age somewhere between 11 and 13. You were supposed to get your hormones would kick in.
Yeah.
And you would decide that you would be more interested in cars, sports, or girls.
Yeah.
That happened. But just before that was when DC resurrected the Flash. Mm. And I remember I knew who Carmine Infantino was.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how, but I knew back then. And I think his name was somehow his name was. So maybe that was sort of the beginning of people beginning to identify people. They had been being identified by EC.
Right.
Before that point. And so they really started the thing. But I mean, in terms of the DC, which was the big one at the time, nobody expected anybody to get credited in Dell. It just wasn't their business model.
Yeah, it's sometimes it's a lot of research for me to figure out who did a book, and when I have looking at some golden age Dell or whatever Disney stuff, I do. So you moved to New York in your 20s. I grew up in New York. I moved to the Northwest in my 30s, but in terms of theater and also comics, what were the scenes like? How intimidating was it for you to jump into both of those places in New York?
More so in theater. I think because it was what I really wanted to do.
Yeah.
I was more intimidated about it and more vulnerable about rejection than comics. And I think what sort of saved my life as I was getting started in comics was that sense of, well, I'm doing this as my day job.
Right.
which sounds crazy now, but that was it. That was my idea, is that I would do comics as a day job, and somehow, and I was, there was something about it too. I did get a job very early on doing theater for a place called CSC Repertory,
Mm-hmm.
and it was an off Broadway theater that became off Broadway
Mm-hmm.
the next year, and I became the associate director. And I somehow, because of that, and this was the end of the first year that I was in New York, and I somehow, because of that, thought, well, this is going to be easy. I had answered an ad in Backstage magazine and got invited to come down and see one of our plays, which was Titus Andronicus. Come see it. And one of Shakespeare's stranger plays, and more difficult plays. And I saw it and was impressed by what they did. But there were there were at least 50 people there that night also applying for the job.
Wow.
And then he had a meeting with all of these people, and I thought, well, I don't stand a chance. And then it got narrowed down. And finally it got narrowed down to me and a guy from Yale. And they had this interview. It was terrible. It was a showdown interview.
Mm-hmm.
And you went into the theater, and there were two stools with two spotlights. And from the dark, the people who ran the theater threw questions at us. And I remember, this is unheard of.
Yeah.
I remember the question. We tossed a coin to see who would go first. The guy from Yale won, and thank God he said he wanted to go first. So they asked him, and the guy who ran the theater was very much of a kind of a. There was a lot of ego there.
Yeah.
And I don't think he really even wanted a second director, but his compatriots who had founded the theater said, no, we have to have another director. And so his question was, you just saw Titus Andronicus at our theater. He had this very basso voice. At our theater. If you were directing Richard III for us, what would you do as a concept? Which is like, and the poor guy from Yale tried, I don't know, a metaphor, maybe a metaphor, like a spider metaphor. And he was just floundering, trying to think of something to say. And I thought, well, they'll shoot me a no question. No, they said, all right, Mr. Hall, what would you do? And all I could say was, I don't know. I'd have to think about it, which I would not have said if I had gone first.
Right.
But I listened to the guy and said, this is an impossible question.
Yeah.
And I think I came off as sounding remarkably intelligent because I didn't try to answer the question, and I got the job. But it was paying even less than Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
So I pursued the I kept pursuing the comic book thing. And the guy who ran it was a bit of a megalomaniac, and I thought, oh, well, this is okay. After a year and a half, I left.
Mm.
I never saw another ad for a director again. You had to go, and I very quickly found out that what you needed to have done was gone to one of like 3 or 4 different schools,
Mm-hmm.
or you go knocking on you cold call all kinds of producers and agents.
Yeah.
And you have nothing to sell them as a theater director, unless you have a show that you can invite them to which they do not want to come. You have to drag them.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be the person who says, let's try out this new guy.
Yeah.
And I eventually, I'm not the most assertive person in the world, and I eventually just hated that so much that I found this was not the way I was going to get any work in the theater, but it was the way I could get work in the comics field because I had something to show them. I wasn't me. As a director, they're really judging you. It doesn't matter whether your work is any good, which is why you see so much crappy stuff. they're judging your personality. Oh, gee, would he be fun to work with? Would he create a fun environment? Not, can he do a good show? Because nobody knows how to do that. Nobody
No.
knows what makes the show, really, nobody knows what makes a show good. It's just somebody like a Harold Prince, for instance, will show up and he knows. He knows. He doesn't know more than anybody else knows who has studied directing, but there's something he can do. He's a storyteller, and there's something he can do, and he has imagination, and who knows why? Who knows why some people who are utterly trained by the best people in the world, their stuff is awful, and other people just can walk in and do it, and they and all the training helps, but
Well, personality really helps if you're working with actors. I got to imagine if you can't work with them, they're not going to perform well for you.
Right. And it turns out that is true in comics as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's easier. You're judging something that's on this piece of paper. There are only a few people in comic books that have ever really lost their job because they were just horrible people.
Yeah.
You know, for the most part, you don't like it if somebody doesn't like your work, but it's not you. You don't think. Now, a little bit later on, I think you realize it is you. But you know, you're going into it, and you're trying to learn the craft.
Mm-hmm.
And your first things, what you're showing, and again, there are people who are exception to this, but for most of us, what we tried to do when we went in was just prove that we were able. We know the craft. We can draw biceps. We'll get it done on time. We'll blah 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 blah.
And even if you hate drawing motorcycles,
you'll
still get it done.
And you know, you eventually realize that no, this is me. If you are any good and you stay with it, you're showing you're putting yourself out there.
Yeah.
You just don't think of it that same way. But you are, and he's talking about motorcycles. My first job was doing the Champions, and I had to draw Ghost Rider, who, this is crazy because it's a group book, and they threw Ghost Rider in because he was popular, and it was a group made up of all the Marvel misfits at that point. Mm-hmm. The Angel, the Iceman, the X-Men. Believe it or not, the X-Men were not popular.
Right.
They were the least popular group that Marvel had going for them up until the revival.
Yeah.
When Len and Cockrum revived it. And so it's the two X-Men, the Black Widow, and who had never had her own book. She had her own backstory.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not backstory. I keep thinking backstory means something else. I think of backstories in comics as being the story that's in the back of the front.
Oh yeah, she had was Amazing Adventures. She was
yeah. It was the Inhumans and the Black Widow, which I actually loved, and it was, for one thing, Neil was drawing the Inhumans,
mm-hmm.
and Don Heck was drawing the Black Widow, and it was some of Heck's best, most dynamic work, beautifully inked by Bill Everett in one of them, and Sal Buscema on a second one, and that was gorgeous. But one forgets that under the right circumstances, Heck could do just fantastic work. But anyway, the Black Widow was in it, and Hercules, and somebody named Dark Star, was a female character who I don't know if she's ever been used again. I suppose she has. They all get used again.
They all show up somewhere else.
And the Ghost Rider. Well, Ghost Rider was in it as an afterthought because they thought they needed somebody popular, more popular than these guys to carry the book. But Ghost Rider is the ultimate loner. I mean, you know, it's like, how do you fit him in? And the rule was that if he was Ghost Rider, he had to be on his bike.
That's right, because he's
At
not
that,
Ghost Rider if he's just walking around.
right. So I was always having to draw this bike, and I'm not a motorcyclist. In fact, I have vertigo, and as I've gotten older, I can't even ride a bike without getting dizzy. I don't know why that is. I have
Mm.
no idea about it. It's just there. So I should never be allowed on a motorcycle, for Christ's sake. And so I'm trying to draw a motorcycle. And one of the first thing you find out when you start doing comics,
Mm-hmm.
drawing comics, is that you can't draw. You think you can draw, but you've been drawing superheroes and you've been drawing jungle things and you know all those outer space things. Dr. Doom's laboratory. Now you're being asked to draw living rooms and offices. In this case, Ghost Rider was on his motorcycle in the middle of an office that was on fire. Now this is pre-internet.
Yeah.
So just trying to find reference on an office, for God's sake. I had to get my wife to she got the people she was working for to let me come in after hours and sketch her office because she was doing temp work. And you think about it, you know, it's problematic because you probably can't just sit down and draw an office without some reference.
Yeah.
But still, everybody knows if you get it wrong.
Right, because we've all been in offices and a lot of us worked
we've all been in living rooms. We've all been in kitchens. Those are the hardest things to draw to begin with because you look at it and you say, that doesn't look like it. That doesn't look like an armchair. You know, how many people have spent any time drawing? Now, if I do panels, I try to convince kids to go out and sketch everything. Stop copying, you know, Jim Lee and manga, and just start drawing what you see in front of you until you're comfortable with it. And the other thing that you had to do, and John really tried to lay this in, but it was difficult, is everything is just a shape.
Yeah. And
he would even avoid using proper terms for muscles, you know, like he was talking about the shoulder bumps.
Oh, okay.
And a kid said, "You mean the deltoid?" I said, "Yeah, the deltoid, the shoulder bump." And he knew what it was called. He was trying to convince you it's not a word, it's a bump, it's a shape.
Yeah.
And eventually you would learn to draw the shape of a motorcycle as opposed to start where you go wrong if you're not drawing shapes is we identify things by detail.
Yeah.
So the intuitive thing to do is to start drawing the detail. You must be counterintuitive and avoid the detail until the very last minute. Because if you've got the proper shape, you're in control of how that works. You can move it around. You can turn it upside down. You can wreck it if it's a motorcycle.
Yeah.
And then if you need reference, which I do, if I'm drawing a motorcycle and I want to make it halfway realistic, then I go and start get a picture. And it doesn't matter if it's the same pose as the motorcycle I've drawn. All I need to do is say, oh yeah, there's this and this in the motor and blah, blah, blah. And I can add it in. If I'm going to, which is what I did, I bought a little motorcycle and was looking at that. And I got as many photos I bought motorcycle magazines. The photo reference that you find is never the photo reference that you would like to find. It's never just exactly the right angle or this or that. And so if you're learning to draw the shape, you own that. You can move it around. You can do what you want with it. And you can lay out the whole comic. If you start drawing with the detail, it may take you hours, and then you'll stand back and look at it and realize it doesn't tell the story that you were trying to tell.
Did you keep a big morgue file back then?
Hmm.
Was that, and yeah.
I still have, I mean, I've thrown away most of the stuff that was clippings.
Hmm.
I'll have a ton of books that I can't bear to get rid of that I never look at anymore because
Right.
I don't need them now. If I want reference, obviously I go to the internet like everybody else does.
Yeah. But there, it is interesting because some of the old photo books, the hardcover photo books that we would have, in 70s, the 60s, and into the 80s, when I think like the explosion was, I had a lot of nature photo books. There's a lot of photos in there that don't exist on the internet because nobody ever bothered to transfer them.
I have a number of, I think my favorite ones are architecture,
Hmm.
various kinds. And I would imagine that most of that stuff can be found on the internet,
Yeah.
but uh, I've used some of those books so much that I know, oh, okay, the thing I need is about 2/3 of the way in, and
Hmm.
a couple of pages, and there it is.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, it's also still fun to hold books in your hands.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
that's
just jumping ahead to this, obviously, direct inspiration for the name of my channel, West Coast Avengers. You are a co-creator, penciler on it. Did you design the logo?
no, I didn't design anything.
You didn't design anything, so you were just throwing on the book, another team book, because it's Bob, and even
Hmm.
Bob hates team books, but we're going to put him on one.
I got team books. Boy, did I hate doing team books for the longest time. I got better at it, but I'm pretty sure I got people where I was being assigned team books because I had been trained by John Buscema, who was
Yeah.
the ultimate team book guy. He could do them in, it didn't much matter to John. It seemed like John could do a single character book or a team book in about the same amount of time. Uh, it was so astonishingly quick. I have never been astonishingly quick, and trying to fit all those people into the book always flummoxed me. But
Hmm.
the West Coast was my favorite team book I think I did. Yeah, really, because it was a controllable number of people,
Sure,
and I
sure.
and I liked the characters. It was kind of a, it was it had a comic spirit to it, even when it was being serious, and I liked that. Um, the only thing I think I designed was this character called the Blank,
Yeah, yeah, where he's literally a blank.
a kind of a blank, and he wasn't invisible. He was a blank, and
Hmm.
so we did that, and I was able to design that and his secret identity, which is basically, if you look at the character, he's Roger Stern.
Oh, is he? That's
Yeah.
really cool. I think he appears in, it was the third or fourth issue that I was seeing some. Was that screen tone or duo? What were you using, or zipatone? I mean, that's the blank, right?
Me, I wasn't using anything. You got to remember that I'm a penciler at
Flip,
this point,
right?
and Brett Breeding is making decisions. Like I may have made a note to use zip tone. I don't remember
Hmm.
because I didn't do it. It was Breeding did it, and Breeding I might very logically have suggested that he use zip tone because he could do that well. There were certain people that could, and certain people that, like Tom Palmer and Brett.
Hmm. Those were
And so probably I think it was a mutual decision, but it was Brett doing it.
so New York in that time period was the hub for comics. Everybody was there. Did you ever have a studio with anybody else, or were you kind of solitary with just,
I was always solitary,
yeah, yeah.
and for one thing, since I was juggling theater, I
Mhm.
would be working at the oddest times. I spent a lot of late hours,
Yeah.
uh, and also just the economics then were crazy. We had, I think our apartment cost $350 a month. It's a one-bedroom apartment in the heart of Manhattan, half a block from the Museum of Natural History. But it's the Upper West Side, and that was considered a bad area.
Sure.
And we moved in back then. Lots of drugs. There was a big, Davies Tavern was a major cocaine drop. And it was right on the corner. And a few weeks after we moved in, there was a laundromat about a block away, and a severed head was found in the dryer, which eventually I worked into my Armed and Dangerous work.
Yes.
So it was the economics, $350. That seemed like quite a bit of money at the time, but eventually, because it was a one-bedroom apartment, two of us living there, it was cheaper for me to rent a second apartment. And I found a studio apartment. We lived on 81st Street. I found one on 96th Street that I could rent and use as a studio. And I think collectively it still was costing us about, then by that time it was costing us more like $650 a month, which seemed like a lot of money, but it was clearly, we had to get me out of the house. I mean, it was just impossible, but we got a break. At that time in New York, you would get a year's, maybe it's different now, you would get a year's lease. And that was to find out basically they wanted to know if you were going to pay the rent.
Yeah.
And if you got through the year's lease, then you could request a longer lease. But at the end of the first year, we went to visit our landlord. And because we thought we're from the Midwest, and we thought we're good Midwesterners, we thought we ought to at least meet our landlord, for God's sake. And so we went in, and it was a guy named Joel Jablonski. He was short, older man who had been in a concentration camp. He had the tattoo.
Yeah.
And it had affected him. And he had a lot of PTSD. And so we said, hello, Mr. Jablonski, we're from 155 West, your tenants from 155 West 81st. We'd just glad to meet you. And he looked at us and said, why'd you come here? I hate you. I hate all my tenants. Why'd you come here and bother me with things like a lease? You're going to come here and into my office and talk to me about a lease? What are you doing? And he began to turn purple.
Yeah.
He was funny. And he turned around and went away and stood in the corner. And his office manager came over and said, I'm sorry. You perhaps you noticed the tattoo. It's something that happens to him. It has nothing to do with you. Please paperwork and I'll take care of it.
Wow.
We went away. We never heard from them again. And the rent never went up. It was supposed to, it would be a 2-year lease, and then it would go up, and then it would be 2 years, and then it would go up again. And 15 years later, we were still paying $350 a month. It was like getting one of those genius grants or something. It got me through some of the more difficult times in New York, and made it possible for me to rent the studio, because obviously we were not going to move out of this place.
Of course not. Wow. And for anybody watching, that one-bedroom apartment would probably be about $4,600 a month now, and the studio would probably be about $2,800 a month now, if not more.
Yeah, and my ex-wife still lives there, and she is paying, I think, around $800 a month for this. And you've got to realize that this has now become prime real estate.
Yeah, this is everybody moved that way in the last years. That's amazing. 800. Well, that's one reason why old businesses and people can live in New York for the long term, is because of rent control does exist.
Yeah. Without that, it becomes an island of the very rich.
Yeah. Where now, I know the whole like bullpen thing is kind of fabricated, or it's embellished, but what were the Marvel offices? I assume you would go in every once in a while, or every week, or every day. What was it?
I would go in. I would take stuff in. They would send a messenger,
Hmm.
but I like to go in because it was how you found your next job.
Sure,
You
sure.
were, you were there, and you'd had something to show somebody, and if they seemed saying, "Oh, that's really great," got any work for me?
Mm,
Uh, so we did that. The bullpen was primarily at first you met the editors.
hmm.
When I first started, it was Archie Goodwin.
Right.
Jim Shooter was his assistant. Uh, and there were not other sub-editors around. That didn't exist. It was Marvel had always been a editor-in-chief,
Hmm.
and that was sort of the paradigm, and it stayed that way for a long time until at this period, uh, some of the really top-rate people were um, doing the writer-editor thing,
Yeah.
so that you would be editing your own book. This was a terrible idea. Um, if you are not old enough to remember what happened with Marvel, you can look at Image in
Sure.
the 90s, and the same thing happened. Is all of a sudden nothing gets in on time.
No.
Nobody is telling you that you have to be faster. Because you're not going to tell yourself. You just,
No.
oh,
No. You
it'll be okay.
work
It'll
your
be
own
okay.
pace.
It'll be okay. And you begin to have the illusion that it can be okay because they'll wait for it because it'll be high quality when it finally comes out.
Hmm.
And to get really the whole story of why that doesn't work, you need Jim Shooter,
Sure. Sure.
because he really understood the returns and the whole thing and what happened if you were late and how it affected the vendors and everything. And so beautiful work was being done, and Marvel was slowly going bankrupt
Yeah.
because everything was late. Everything was late. And well, when Stan decided to become the publisher and focus on films, Roy Thomas became the editor, and that was
Hmm.
okay. Roy could handle it, but
Yeah.
but very few people had Stan's energy or ability just to somehow I can do 10 or 12 books a month,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
and, and be the editor and be writing most of them,
And
and of
be the
course,
marketer, the main marketing guy too.
yeah, and of course, yes, what everybody talks about and this remains controversial is yes, people like Jack and um, Ditko would be coming up with plots and presenting them to Stan, which I'm sure he was delighted
Of course.
that they were coming out, and uh, nobody will ever know how much who did what. Although you can look at the dialogue, and here's my person. Okay.
All right. So we were talking about Stan and yeah, the endless debate. I always look at it like you can't have one without the other. Even if Stan didn't write much, he's still the person that, you know, was yelling about it to every single person that would listen. Read Marvel Comics. I mean, you have to have that person.
And there was stuff that you look at and if you compare, Jack had come back to Marvel and was writing when I was there. In fact, I became an editor briefly,
Mhm.
and I did one of Jack's books, Devil Dinosaur,
Oh, such
which which I really didn't edit because Jim was hiring sub editors because
Mhm.
everything was behind, and he realized quite properly no one person can handle this anymore. He needs to have a team, and he wanted me to do it because I'd written a play. I'd written a version of Dracula that ran off Broadway for 2 years with another guy. So he knew I could write,
Mhm.
and I also could do art. And of the editors that were coming in, most of them were writers. And he figured having one person who could also do talk to about the art was a good
Yeah.
thing. And he called me up and asked me if I wanted to do it, and I said no, because I had the play running, and it was supposedly going to be done in London. We didn't know exactly when, but I was certainly going to go over for that. And also, I knew how much trouble Marvel was in with deadlines.
Sure.
They were really in trouble, and I knew that was going to involve a lot of calling up artists and possibly even firing some.
Oof.
And I don't know that I wanted to do that. Jim, I think, may have thought that I was just negotiating and kept offering me more money. So finally, I got to a point. He made me an offer I couldn't refuse, but I said, look, whenever this is happening in London, I'm going to do it. And my guess is that it's going to be 6 months from now.
Mm-hmm.
And if my doing it for 6 months is of any value to you, I'll do it. And he said, yes. And,
He needed all the help he could get.
And so we were, and so things changed, and it became more logically, and we slowly got things more on time. The funny thing being that everybody was behind, except Jack, of course, who was 6 months ahead. And so I had to make up reasons to call up Jack and say something to him just so I could talk to Jack Kirby.
Sure.
I talked to him on the phone a couple of times. And but you read Devil Dinosaur, there is something wonderfully naive, and I don't mean that badly.
Yeah.
I mean that naive and charming about Jack's writing.
Mm-hmm.
But to say that Jack wrote Thor, just read some of Jack's stuff and then read Thor. There's no question as to Stan's. It's an interactive process, you know. Whomever comes up with the plot, and I'm sure sometimes it was Stan, sometimes it was Jack. It gets drawn in the Marvel method. The writer looked at what had been drawn and wrote dialogue based on what's there, which sounds like it shouldn't work, but it worked beautifully.
Sure.
And you could tell Stan had a style of writing.
Yeah.
And you know, and people just, he just tweets it right. He's doing some of his wisecracks. No, it was a whole gestalt of how Marvel comics felt, and they felt different from a DC comic. And a lot of that was Stan's writing.
Yeah.
And in some ways, his writing also may feel a little dated now.
Yeah,
but the fact is that everything, I hate the word dated, because maybe saying it's of its time, that doesn't mean Shakespeare was of his time. He's not of our time, but that doesn't mean it's still not the best stuff ever written.
He's still the most influential human being to ever write anything.
And Stan also was a Shakespeare fan. Mm-hmm. And if you read, for instance, Thor, there's who is Thor? Well, he's Henry the Fifth, or young Prince Hal, and Odin is Henry the Fourth, and he hangs out with his friends, one of whom is called Volstagg, who is really Falstaff, and that's a Stan thing. That's the kind of thing Stan would come up with, I'm sure.
And every cover title, like "Lo, behold this," or it's all steeped in Shakespearean type writing,
right? So
I think. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, just what Stan, and also what Stan clearly did was invent the entity called Marvel.
Yes.
Again, talking about the gestalt of it, the whole feel of it, and without that, none of this happened.
Right. I think the debate truly exists because Jack got the raw deal. Jack didn't get the fame and the money, which he was clearly owed and deserved. And I think that's what spurns the argument, because when you look at it in the way you just contextualize it, yeah, you have both sides, and they're both equally important.
Yeah, and the thing is that Stan continually featured Jack. He talked about Jack. He talked about Jack's work. He did all those things. They would Now, no captions on this page. It would be a shame to ruin the art.
Yeah.
He certainly gave Jack a lot of credit. It just, on one level, it wasn't what Jack wanted. I think Jack probably deserved, since he equally invented Marvel.
Yeah.
If he were still alive, there would certainly be some lawyers saying, okay, some of that money goes to Jack. But it's an interactive.
Yeah.
And who made Marvel what it is? Well, some people who weren't even fan favorites. Stan did, Dick Ayers did, Marie Friend did.
Such an important part of Marvel.
And I can't even name them all now. The real bullpen, the people. We were all supposed to be happy people who lived in the bullpen, but of course, none of us did. It was just a certain group of people who were astonishing.
Yeah.
When I got to be doing the editor, I learned more from those people that were around. People who had been working forever and who didn't really want to do regular books, a lot of them. They had done that. They had done it for years. And I understand that more now than I did then. You don't want to stay up until 3 a.m. to get it done.
Yeah. And then again and again and again.
The people who don't mind doing that, or people who are they're freaks of nature. Somebody like a Buscema who could turn out close to 5 pages a day. And Jack was even faster than that. Now, John could do it with breakdowns. He would be doing beautiful line work, but wouldn't be putting in the shading. That would be depending on the inker. Jack could do it and be doing finished pages, because he was just, in addition to being this creative genius, he was the fastest gun alive.
Yeah. I think Johnny Romita too is another one of those guys that it felt like there was a period of time where what wasn't he doing?
Yeah.
I do want to, speaking about non-monthly books, I do want to talk about your 2 very well-known graphic novels. You did Squadron Supreme and you did Emperor Doom. And I know you've cited Emperor Doom being your favorite thing that you did for Marvel. It also, to me, shows like a little shift in your art style a bit. I think that's fair to say. There was something in there that I was looking at it the other day, and I'm like, especially like looking at some of the other things from Marvel, there was a shift in your art style, which went a little bit more, maybe more lines, bigger lines. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but what was your experience with those 2 books? And
well, first of all, Emperor Doom, I inked it myself.
Yeah,
that's why it looks different.
Yeah.
And my ink style has always been different from my pencil style.
Very.
For a lot of people, they're the exact. John Byrne, you could like have poured the ink on. If someone could just cling to his pencils, it would be exactly there. I never have quite mastered that. My pencils are a guide for the inking, as opposed to being, you could photograph this and it would be how I wanted it to look. Okay. The ink version is how I want it to look. And drawing for somebody, penciling for somebody else, I found that how I wanted something inked was that there weren't that many people who could do that, or who did it. They did it their own way. And so I began to pencil something that had clarity for whoever was going to ink it. Yeah. As opposed to being a style. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So that I think is the difference. Squadron looked different because one of the people who I thought nailed what I wanted was John Beatty,
Hmm.
and he did the first. But John had a I don't know whether it was an actual contract or a handshake agreement with Marvel that he would ink uh,
All of Zek's work.
Zek's work,
Yeah.
and he was free. Zek was working on something else or taking a break or something,
Hmm.
and then after about a third of it was done, he had to leave it and go do Zek's work. Now I really, really liked what Beatty did, and it was a different look and one that I could play to, and I could pencil for that look, and be
Hmm.
very satisfied that it was how I would want something. Sam De La Rosa then took over,
Hmm.
and it was a damn fine piece of inked work,
Yeah.
but it was a standard Marvel look,
Hmm.
uh, much more so than what Beatty had been doing. And then eventually, the other thing that happened with the book is that I burned out.
Yeah.
I got 2/3 of the way through it, and as they added new characters, I just wasn't fast enough to do it
Yeah.
and turn it out. If I could go back, I probably would have gone to um, the powers that be and said, "Let me finish it and break down,
Hmm.
so that I don't have to stay up till I always say 3 in the morning." But sometimes it was on that book. Sometimes it was just an all-nighter period, and but I didn't. I had been really, really, really done tight pencils, and it would have been very hard for me psychologically to want to shift to something else. So I just said and also if you're burnt out, you're burnt out. You know, it's hard to go in and say, I'm really burnt out, but I think I could do it this way. I was going in and saying, I don't ever want to see this book. I never said that, but you know, it was
You
I
put it out.
was really worn out
Yeah.
with that one, and it was a point at which thought I even thought, do I really want to do this anymore? If I can't get faster, I think I really, really focused on speed more after that point. Emperor Doom was a little different because it was not in continuity. Uh,
Right.
you've called um, Squadron a graphic novel, and it's I like it in print. It's been in print several times as a graphic novel, but it was done as a monthly.
It was. Okay.
Yeah, so that it was on a tight monthly schedule too. If it had been like Emperor Doom, where it was out of continuity, um, I could take whatever time I needed
Hmm.
with the book to ink it and make it whatever, however I felt.
Sure.
I mean, within reason, but
Yeah. Those formats that they used to release in the 80s, the graphic novel magazine size, those were a special thing. I mean, there are so many interesting things that people were doing, like Emperor Doom, or what Frank and Sankiewicz did with Daredevil. There was
right.
just these beautiful looking books that I wish Marvel would even pretend to give a shit about and make stuff like that again. But
Yeah, I think there's all kinds of good stuff. I think I wish they would do it. Maybe they have. I don't know exactly what they have done and what they haven't done.
mhm.
The Weird World series, I
Yeah,
thought I thought ought to be a graphic novel, and maybe it has been. I don't know.
I think
Uh,
I don't think so. I could be wrong also.
yeah,
The only, the only
but
thing they're doing these days is they're doing treasury size stuff. They are doing that stuff again.
yeah.
It's nice. But
So
those days are long gone, treasuries.
yes, yes. I have. I found a bunch of old treasuries, and I only had saved two or three of them, and I immediately snatched them up. I loved the treasury size things. It was just so great to see it at that size.
Yeah, yeah. And when you look back at those, it was Shaq, it was John, it was Neil, it was all these guys that you really want to, Bernie, even DC has a couple of the House of Mystery ones with Sergio Aragones and Bernie, and
Mm-hmm.
such amazing stuff. So I do want to point out, I know you're aware of this, but I feel like you might hold the record in comics for drawing the most famous people. You've drawn the SNL cast members, you've drawn Kiss, you've done movie adaptations of Willow and Darkman, and then there's Aerosmith in Valiant. Is that something that you've kind of been aware of throughout your career? It's like I, I get to draw all these real famous, these actual people.
The only time I was ever aware of it going in was most of the time that was a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
SNL was not. I was an editor at that point. Belushi had been to the offices. I missed him. I wasn't there that day.
Mm-hmm.
But he wanted to come up and look around to the office. He was a big comics fan.
That makes sense.
And somehow then I think Claremont got the idea from that of what if we did, he was doing Team Up at the time, and I was editing it. What if we did Spider-Man meets the Not Ready for Primetime Players, as they were called then. And so it was okay. Jim talked to Lorne Michaels, who took the call. Jim's, I think, still surprised that he took the call.
Yeah.
And I wasn't going to let anybody else pencil it because I knew we'd get to go to 30 Rock and actually sketch the people and meet some of them. Mm-hmm. And that was cool. The Willow, on the other hand, that was fun. And at the end of it, Belushi invited us to the opening night party for Animal House, and we got to go and we gave him the cover.
That's great.
And he was very charming. That's all you can say. He was very charming. Willow, on the other hand, was a pain in the butt because
George Lucas.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We went out to we got to go to Skywalker Ranch.
Ooh.
And see a rough cut. And people had just made a lot of money doing Star Wars, and we were hoping for the same. Now, a lot of people really love Willow, but we saw the rough cut and realized we were not working on something that was going to be in the same league as Star Wars. For one thing, it was just too blatantly a ripoff of The Hobbit.
Yeah.
As much as you might like it or not like it, that it was.
Sure.
And I just got to meet, I can't remember his name, the guy who played Willow.
Warwick Davis.
And he was in the green room, a green room that I was in, and I was able to, I'd never approach people in the green room, celebrities. It just seems like you ought to leave them alone, let him eat the lousy food but I wanted to meet him and say hello. I just wanted to meet you. I did the adaptation of the book, and I was thrilled that he had whoever his handler was go find a copy of Willow from somebody at the convention and bring it to me to sign.
Oh, that's cool.
And I thought that was really cool. However, Lucas, at that time, they were now this sounds really weird given what they do now with films, that you're getting previews of them forever on the internet and things at San Diego and all that sort of stuff. They were really tight to the vest about Willow, and they trying to get reference out of them. Well, you saw the rough cut. Yeah, but you see, we were just seeing the movie. I can't.
Yeah, you're taking it in for the first time.
And a lot of people in it weren't known people.
Sure.
At the time.
I mean, Kilmer wasn't a big star then.
Kilmer, I think it was Kilmer's first big starring role.
Yeah.
I couldn't even get a good look at what Kilmer looked like. So that was difficult. Plus, they had not gotten used to the idea that what do you do about the special effects? Because none of those were in the rough cut.
Yeah.
They hadn't done them yet. And we want to see reference on them. Well, we don't have reference on them. Well, you must have reference. Yeah, but we don't want to let it out. We don't want it to get past her.
Yeah.
So we got to the end of the book, and there was the end of the book was a dragon.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "What's a dragon look like?" It's a two-headed dragon. Okay, two heads. What kind? What do they look like? Well, like a dragon. Well, like, and I'm trying to think of like the one in Sleeping Beauty. Yeah, just like that, like the Disney one. Okay, that's what I drew. A double-headed dragon that looked like that. It looked a little like the Roy Harryhausen headed dragon. And it didn't look anything like that when the movie came out. And they said, it doesn't look anything like that. That's not like what a dragon looks like. I said, well, you said, no. Do you have pictures of it yet? Yeah, we can send you pictures of it now. Okay, it looked like two penises with teeth. just not even remotely, very Freudian, but not remotely what I've drawn. So we had to redo that one. So drawing the people really depended on having good, on whether they could get you the good reference.
Right.
I also did the Captain America movie, the one with
Steaming Pile.
Son, yeah. And that one was a little different because nobody really gave a shit what it looked like. It was. I signed on for it because Stan was supposed to write it.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'll finally get to work with Stan. And then Stan read the script and said, I can't write this. So I adapted it, and Stan wrote the dialogue, but we never interacted on it. The closest I ever came to interacting with Stan was inviting him. I mean, I knew him. I could say hi to him. I had a small classical theater company in New York, an off-Broadway little company that I formed in the late 80s. And Jim was on the board, and I wanted Stan to be on the board. And I called Stan and asked him, and he said, no, I'm living in Hollywood now. I would never have time to come to a meeting. I said, Stan, I don't want you to come to a meeting. I just want to be the only theater in New York that has Stan Lee on the board.
Yeah.
And he said, oh, well, okay, if I don't have to come to a meeting, I guess I can do it. I'll send you a letter. And he sent us a letter saying, that we printed in the first program, that said, okay, I'll agree to be on your board if you swear that you will never do any adaptations of DC Comics.
Fair enough. You can deal with that.
But and then the Aerosmith thing was equally strange because it was like Steve Mazarsky, who was the CEO of Valiant, did not have a comic book background. He was a rock and roll lawyer.
Yeah.
And had been Aerosmith's lawyer. So we thought he could make this happen, and it almost worked. I thought I wrote a pretty good adaptation that would fit, that they could fit into. I felt that the likenesses were okay.
Yeah.
And I was hoping that I could ink them myself, but the thing got drawn, inked. I think I had penciled it, but it got inked at the last moment because we could not get the things okayed.
Yeah.
They were being, we would send them to the Aerosmith people, and we wouldn't hear back, and we didn't hear back. And finally, we had to go to Steve, can you use your influence? Can you go directly to the band members? And because we wanted to be able to get this out. He did. And they were kind of appalled. They said, nobody ever talked to us about this. I think they thought we would just be offended, but they said, what if they didn't like it or something? He said, this is fine, go ahead. But by that time it was we had about a week to put the faces together. I mean, other stuff had gotten inked, but it was, so some of it didn't turn out quite like I would have liked it to, but it was okay. And I did get to meet the band, and they were lovely. They especially Tom Hamilton, the bass player, just very nice. He sort of saw me standing around backstage. I mean, I got to go backstage
Yeah.
at concerts, and he saw me standing around, and he knew why I was there. So he came over and would tell me stories and stuff. And I thought very gracious of him. But I met them all. And then eventually I did a signing with them in Chicago.
Oh, that's right.
And that was so weird because there was this long table in a private room, and there was Aerosmith. And then at the end of the table was me. And people were coming in saying, okay, we'll get the signature. Who's the guy at the end of the table? They assumed I was some part of management or something. One person came in and didn't want Aerosmith's signature. They only wanted mine. And I wish I'd kept that person's name or something.
Yeah.
I would be sending them free comics. But they had a bodyguard, huge guy, kind of like Rosie Greer, if that makes any sense. It won't to a lot of people, but
I'll get the picture.
And, huge football player, linebacker size.
Yeah.
And I remember I went to the bathroom one time and came back in, and he could not figure out why I was there. He sort of picked me up, raised me sort of at least onto my toes and said, where are you going? I'm the artist, remember? Oh, yeah. Okay. This happened twice. And the third time it happened was Steve Tyler got bored, and he said, I want to go to the convention. And the security people, of which there were a bunch standing around all the time, said, Steve, you can't go to the convention with us, and we have not set up for anything like that. But they never got that much out because they said, Steve, you can't. He was out the door. And proper rock style, rock and roll hero style. And they said, okay, you all have to go. And they got Aerosmith security people and the convention security people, and they were all going as a group. And I just said, I'll stay behind and wait for them to get back. And they said, no, you have to be part of this. We all have to stick together.
You're a man now.
Went and started out the stairs. Here's Rosie Greer, sort of picking me up and saying, where are you going? I said, I'm the artist, remember? And he said, yeah. There were not a lot of bulbs in this chandelier, no. but he was certainly big. And the light bulb went off in my head, and I said, you're in the comic too. And he said, yeah. And all of a sudden I became part of the rock group. For about another hour, I was part of the rock group. And he was bringing me Cokes and all kinds of stuff. And then Monday I went home and had to call the office and say, could you send me back the last page of this? Because if I don't draw this guy in somewhere, I could be dead meat.
He's gonna find you.
He's gonna find me. Yeah.
That's really funny, and I do want to just say thanks for working on one of my favorite cult movies of all time. That's Darkman, which with this amazing Joe Jesco cover.
Yeah, and Darkman was the same in a way that I did not have enough reference on Liam Neeson or Mrs. Coen brother,
Frances McDormand.
Frances McDormand, which was one of her first movies too, I think. Yeah. And Neeson has such a strong features that it came off kind of looking like him. She was a bit generic, but it was the nature of the book that it didn't require, I think, the same kind of referencing problems that, and it was interesting. A lot of it I just drew from the script. And Tex inked the first issue. He didn't do the rest of it. And I think he didn't do the rest of it because he got called out on it. He changed something. There's supposed to be one guy with he has a wooden leg, only the wooden leg is really a machine gun. And if you see the movie, he's standing there hopping the whole time.
Yeah.
Taking off the leg. And Tex just couldn't figure that out. I think he thought that was still silly and that I had made it up, and he undid it. And I had to go back to the editor and say, look, guys, I'm sorry, but this is an important part of the movie. Yeah. And so Tex had to, I redo it again, and Tex re-inked it. But then I think he decided not to do the rest of it. And I can understand why. It seemed like it was a really silly Sam Raimi kind of thing. And if you didn't kind of appreciate Sam Raimi, you could
Right.
think it's just odd. And it is just odd, but
It is. It is. But hey, look, I mean, who would have known, Sam Raimi getting involved with a movie like that, Marvel putting it out, and then Sam Raimi would have this amazing legacy with their movies at this point. And
yeah,
I'm sure it's not done because, you can rely on him. He's a brilliant filmmaker. And
yeah,
he
yeah,
Evil Dead 2 was like the first like low budget horror movie I'd ever seen, and it affected me so much that I went to film school for a year.
oh yeah, and it's just beyond it's nobody else has ever made a movie like that before or since. It's like absolutely crazy, out of its mind. Um,
Absolutely. He's brilliant. But so I do want to talk about towards the mid 90s, you go over to Valiant.
mhm.
And Valiant's a huge part of my childhood. I was 12, 13, maybe 14 at oldest when I started picking up those books. And I know they started out with the Nintendo and the wrestling stuff. You did some of the wrestling illustration for them or no?
Boy, you've done your research.
Yeah.
Yes, I did 2 wrestling posters was all. I didn't do any of the actual stories, but I don't even remember which guys they were. I think it was
Maybe the Bushwhackers?
no. I I can't remember. I really can't remember who all it was. Not current household names.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Would have been
and,
guys.
but I wasn't getting work from Marvel, and I had a bad experience, which I think affected my ability to get work from them because I had agreed to do. This is my story. Maybe the editor would have a different story, but I agreed to do a Nick Fury series, and I really wanted to do it. And so, Bob Harris was writing it, and I can't remember what commitment I had. I had some kind of a commitment. Maybe it was a theater commitment. I don't know. But I said, I've got a commitment and I can do it. But for the first, like maybe 3 to 4 issues, I will be doing something else as well. And I won't be able to make the deadline unless there's a script waiting for me. When I'm done with it,
Yeah.
turn it in, I need to start the next script or it will never happen. And so turned in the first one, no script. And I said, okay, this is whatever it was, Thursday or something. What about early next week? I can still make it. Script. And the end of that week, there still wasn't a script. And I said, guys, I can't do this. You'll never have it on time for me now. I've told you I'm doing something else and I just can't do it. And 2 things happened. I'm guessing, this is just guessing, and I won't mention names. I just got a feeling that Bob Harris had never been told this.
Yeah. Poor
and then he became the editor-in-chief of Marvel.
Yeah.
So at that point, I just stopped getting work from Marvel. And that was okay because I did have a theater gig, and maybe that was I think that was probably the theater gig that was holding it up. I was the University of Nebraska had asked me to come back and run their summer program and be the artistic director, and so I was doing that as well. And so I called Jim, thinking he might ask me to pencil something. I'd get some penciling work, and he said, "We need writers." And he said, "I'll give you a choice of 5 different of one of 5 different books." And I picked Shadow Man because it was sort of not working. I don't think he had really figured that one out yet. And his everything down to the costume even was not quite. It looked like he was wearing blue Dr. Dentons all the time.
Yeah, it was a very strange costume to begin with.
And so I agreed that I can do that one if I can not reboot it, because that means starting over, but kind of rebooting it. I will try to keep all of the lore and background, but I want to also rework it.
Hmm.
and they were in agreement. And I thought, and my thinking was that it's set in a little corner of the Valiant universe, so I don't have to worry about the whole universe seeing that group book thing. It's not a
Yeah.
group book, and I love New Orleans, and if it works, I'll have to go to New Orleans again.
Mhm.
And
A
and
shame, right?
but the big thing was that it was kind of not working. So I thought, I'm not trying to take over something that's already working really well.
Sure.
If I fail, I'm in good company, and if I succeed, I'll look pretty good because nobody's quite figured it out yet. And it did work. We ended up doing it for
Good. Yeah.
any number of issues until they decided to do a Shadow Man game,
Hmm.
and they wanted a African American protagonist for the game, and Jack was not. Jack was a person of color, but
Yeah.
he was a Creole,
Hmm.
and they wanted me to just start drawing him more African American. And I said, that's a whole culture and it's a whole character, and there were plenty of African American characters, but I felt very uncomfortable making that change. And I said, it's not who he is. I said, why don't give me a few issues and I will wind him up, and then
Hmm.
you can go to another character. And so the part of what had happened before I took it over, when Unity happened, but Jack had met somebody from the future who told him that he would die in 1999,
Right.
be killed by Dark in some sort of thing with Master Dark, the big villain.
Hmm.
And I thought, gee, if somebody told you that, wouldn't that kind of weigh on your mind as you got closer to 1999? And so I had him have a nervous breakdown where he had to find out could he even die before 1999. So he jumps off one of the taller buildings in New Orleans, and I left him halfway down.
They never
and,
did anything with
and
it.
thought they'll do something with this. You can do whatever you want with him then.
Yeah.
Never did a damn thing. As he's still there. He's still there.
Yeah. Oh, poor guy. He's been in purgatory for 25 years.
Well, when Dinesh Chandasani took over Valiant and rebooted it, at one time they were considering using more of us older guys, and I drew one that for Harbinger that Jim had written, and I was going to write something for Shadow Man. And I said my idea was, why don't I, because I had left a way, I had set it up so that he doesn't have to die.
Mm-hmm.
And I know how he gets out of it. We had something called a time arc.
Okay.
And the Dark and his sister had learned the ability to create one of these. And the sister was on the ground watching him. And if he doesn't go splat, she opens a time arc as he falls, and he goes through that, and gets, and he's only in it probably for about 5 minutes, but he comes back, and it's 10 years later.
It's a good one.
And I wrote that, and they bought it. But then they decided that they weren't going to print it because they changed their mind and decided they weren't going to have older guys come in and work on the stuff. And I think they felt it would be too retro.
Well, if they had thought about, I mean, that was what, 2012, or was that more recent?
No, but it was if it was 2012. I would guess it was maybe even a little earlier than that.
Okay, because if now I feel like retro is actually the popular way to go. I'll jump ahead just quickly. You mentioned on another interview that you were doing a comic for the video game, the Shadow Man Dark Legacy. Is that going to be used? Because I think it's coming out this year.
Oh, it's out and done. It was on Free Comic Book Day. If you didn't get your copy, you'll just have to look for it. It's out there somewhere.
Okay, because the interview I watched was, I guess it must have been earlier this year.
Earlier, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it was kind of fun. It wasn't my Shadow Man. but it was a
Mhm.
combination of my Shadow Man and the new Shadow Man, which was interesting
Okay.
because the game, for whatever reasons, they had their own take on the character,
Mhm.
and they had again, my Shadow Man played the saxophone and was a musician,
Yeah.
and this guy and theirs does too, or did. He
Mhm.
apparently he talks about how he had to give up his music career when he became Shadow Man,
Mm.
or it affected. And I thought so. Part of the backstory I did was to look through what they had presented, and anything that went unexplained, I put in the origin story that I tried to mold into the origin story.
Mhm.
And one was that he, as Shadow Man, he plays music that's so weird and that nobody knows what he's doing. It's just too out there.
Yes. Uh, that's really funny.
And that he would that the music gives him the adrenaline rush, and he changes to Shadow Man in front of everybody because their Shadow Man wears he doesn't wear a mask. His whole face is a mask. It becomes
Right. Yeah.
so. Well, that wouldn't work for. I used to do that a lot in the book that he would be in my book in the '90s that he would be playing for stuff, and the audience would be staring at him in disbelief, and then they would realize they had heard something special. In one case, they gave him standing ovation, and in another, they didn't know what he'd done. You know, he was playing. I, I I used to like to base things on things that I would run into in New York. So
Mm.
he was what happened to him when he played his music became based on a guy who would haunt the subways looking for money, and he had a saxophone, and he
Mm.
had no idea how to play it except he would make bleats and hoops with it, and he called it playing his moon music,
Mm.
and 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 he would finish and ask for money, and it got so that he would come on the subway and say, "All right, you know the drill. If you don't want me to play the moon music, you better give me some money." And people would start throwing money at him, and so there was sort of, it wasn't exactly the same, but I said, oh well, what would happen if that was the kind of music that Jack makes when he's Shadow Man?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it
Oh,
was fun. I've always had fun trying to work in stuff that I actually kind of experienced, characters that I would run into,
right. And then,
etc. The whole time arc thing with the Darks was based on, I used to sit and draw in a, I had moved back here
mhm.
before I started working for Valiant, and I would go down to this place called the Mill and work, and they even had one table they just kind of reserved for me, and
That's
because I didn't really have enough room here. And one day a guy came back, sat down with me, and he was an older black guy, and he looked at what I was doing. He said, "What would you be saying if I was to tell you I could slide through time?" And I said, I would want to see you do that. And he said, "Okay, here's the deal now. I go to the bathroom and I come back before I left and find out what you were saying about me while I was gone." Now, that makes no sense at all, but
nope.
it's a wonderful piece of dialogue.
Sure.
And I had to work that in. And of course, in the book, the Darks kidnap him because he can make a time arc.
Wow. That's brilliant when a person says something wildly crazy to you in real life, but it makes sense in the terms of a comic.
It's all grist for the mill, I think, for a comic.
Yeah.
It's great to be able to do that.
Well, and speaking of using real life, Armed and Dangerous, which I was not that was something I was not aware of when it came out. I know it was notoriously low print run, because it was towards the end of Valiant, but I got a chance to check out some of it recently, and, I know you talk about that living in New York, that's where you get a lot of this stuff from Armed and Dangerous from. Also, your art style, the inking and all that, I can't help but think, you know, Frank Miller is a big influence on you for that specific thing, but it's such a very New York feeling comic, even though
Mhm.
it's embellished a little. Obviously, it's embellished because it's comics, but that's such an amazing book, and I would love to tell people to go seek out and buy it, but it is quite hard to find. But you can find it online.
I would like, it was all intended for the first, there was a 4-issue arc and then a one in the middle that was just, that also fits into the continuity,
Yeah.
special, and then another 4-issue arc. It's the second one that really started, the run started to go down on. People can find the first one. The second half is really hard, but it all goes together. And I don't know. I want to approach Valiant. I don't think they are interested in bringing out a compendium, but I'm wondering if I could somehow lease it from them, or
Yeah.
we could reach some agreement that if
Kickstarter.
I published it, or I paid for it, but maybe they published it. I don't know what, but I would really like to see that happen.
It would be lovely to see. I mean, if you could get the rights to do it and then kickstart it, I'm sure,
Yeah.
crowdfunding a collection, an omnibus or whatever you want to call it, maybe even do it oversized would be cool.
Yeah, I think it could be cool. And I think, I don't know, I'm going to contact Fred Pierce and see if he would be at all interested in going that way, because I'm sure they're never going to, it's just not what they're publishing. So
Sure.
maybe it will happen. I hope so. I want to tweak a couple of things, but I think basically it would almost be ready to go.
From the collection.
And the nice thing is that it's in being in black and white. If they don't have the stats from it, because it was statted then, you could really just scan the books in, and then tweak them a little bit, but they would be fine. Much easier than if it was a color.
Sure. And from the reader's perspective and the collector readers, like I would consider myself a collector reader. I love reading, but I love collecting too. The Valiant is kind of coming back. There's a lot of love for it that people hid because, the way that the comic book boom bust happened, a lot of fingers were pointed at people and all that stuff with publishers. But I think people are looking fondly back on that early, even to the late Valiant era, with that idea of like, oh, I'd love to revisit this. I mean, I revisited the first Exo Manowar graphic novel recently, and I mean, it's batshit crazy, but the art in it is fun to look at.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting era that needs further dissection. I do want to ask one other thing that I was really curious about. Do you own a lot of your original art? No. Okay. Because I wasn't able to find anybody that, like the Emperor Doom book, I went on Comic Art Fans. I can't find anybody that owns a page from it.
Everybody, they're all sold.
They're all sold. They're just
it was like any of the stuff that you got back. You just weren't making it before the 90s. You weren't making enough money. You just immediately turned around and sold the stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, except unless you were Al Milgram. He was smart and hung on to it all.
Yeah, and Todd McFarlane's notorious. He never got rid of a Spawn page, which
but of course that's from a whole different era.
Sure. Because Dave, and even earlier, but it's later than the 70s, but Dave Gibbons talks about the fact that he was taking Watchmen pages to a local store and selling them for like £15 each. And it's like one page from that could fund somebody's vacations for 10 years.
Yeah. I was a comic book store opened on Amsterdam Avenue, and they wanted to deal with my stuff, and I consigned a bunch of stuff to them, and went, I don't know, a few weeks later to see what they'd sold, and there was an empty store there.
Oh my gosh!
So there was a whole bunch of stuff that just got into the ether.
Yeah, and that's one of the unfortunate overlying themes through a lot of the early Marvel, DC, and even into the laters. I've heard Bernie Wrightson talk about how when they would give tours to kids at the DC offices, they'd open up a closet and it would just be stacks of artwork, and they would let kids take one page per. And there are stories about Marvel and DC throwing that stuff in the incinerator, which is mind blowing to me.
The friend of mine who had almost no money. I mean, I know they were struggling, uh,
Hmm.
but he managed to buy a Bernie Wrightson page. This is in the 60s.
Hmm.
I'm sorry, uh, mid 70s, and he could no more afford to buy that page now than the Man in the Moon. It was a Swamp Thing page,
My God.
but nobody thought they were worth that much.
Yeah, no, I mean it's the age old story you talk about your parents throwing out your books, and my dad tells me about his mom throwing out all of his cards, including your 52 Mickey Mantle rookie and a Jackie Robinson rookie. Nobody knew, and now we're kind of in that people will know for the rest of their lives. But the way that artwork's going in 20 years, there won't be any original artwork. It'll just be all digital.
Plus, I have stuff that I can't sell. I mean,
Hmm.
I could sell it probably if I were charging maybe $20 a page.
Yeah,
Stuff that just doesn't have a superhero on it, and people are not terribly interested. I take it along because if I'm not going to go below 100, and
yeah,
and occasionally somebody will look at it and buy it who loves just art as opposed to I
sure.
got I bought a Spider-Man page. I think is the deal. We'll deal with a lot of collectors, and then the other collectors who are more professional, who know they're dealing with worth, not with um,
Right.
not necessarily. Of course, everybody loves a beautiful page, but it has to be of a certain value before they're going to invest in it. And you get stuff you think, but this stuff is gorgeous, yeah, but it's not an investment.
Well, I mean, technically, your Armed and Dangerous books don't have a single superhero, and that art arguably your best.
Yeah,
So,
I can't sell it. I positioned some with my agent, for instance. He didn't sell a single page.
really, well,
Yeah.
uh,
So if
that's
you,
a
I've
re-
got, if you want some,
yeah, I do. I mean, I'm I fell in love with art through comics.
mhm.
There was no art in my world until honestly it was Todd, and then from there it was just exploring more comics. And I Bernie Wrightson and Sienkiewicz are two of my favorite artists.
Mhm.
And you look at some of Sienkiewicz's work, and like Stray Toasters or something. There's no superheroes there, but it's amazing.
Yeah, well, of course, yes. Well, sometimes it can be more amazing because you're not dealing with a limitation. Um, I've got one Sienkiewicz page that he inked of
Hmm.
back cover of Captain Marvel, the what's her name, Monica
Hmm. Oh, Monica Rambeau, yeah.
meets Dracula.
Oh, that's right. I've seen that
Yeah,
cover before. It's beautiful.
gorgeous. So I won't give that one up. Uh, but like I've got the game. I mean, that's one the Shadow Man origin story. I got all the pages, and I'd like to sell them. I'd like to sell the 10 pages.
As a story, yeah.
Yeah, but we'll see if anybody wants it. It's like, who knows?
Well, before we wrap up, where can people look at some of your original or contact your agent, about commissions or whatever it is?
For commissions, I work through Catskill Comics, which is just catskillcomics.com. I
Hmm.
got Chris, and you can see a bunch of other wonderful artists uh, on his site as well. Mike Grell, boy, I'm blanking now. Ramon Frieden is one of his,
Hmm.
and a long list of
Yeah,
clients,
I'll put those down below.
and that's fun. Or they can come to me. I'm in the process of doing a new website because mine
Okay.
is hard for me to put up new stuff, but it's still there. So
Hmm.
it's not a lot of new stuff, but you can see it at bobhall.com.
Easy, easy. And are you working currently? What are you working on? Is there anything that's in progress
I
that?
have I have a graphic novel that I'm trying to find time to work on,
Mhm.
and I'm also writing a play.
Oh, wow.
And but really, I'm just doing Comic Cons. I've got to sign off pretty quick here because I got to go pack because I'm going to Austin tomorrow.
Right, Austin and then Baltimore. Will you be at
Well,
New York Comic Con?
I will be
I'll see you there.
great.
Yeah. So yeah, I will put whatever appropriate links below, and there's so much that I still want to touch on, especially the UK and your experience
Let's,
there, because
let's
we
do
both.
another one.
Yeah, we'll definitely do another one. But I really appreciate the time, Bob. I had a lot of fun talking to you, and like I said, there's much more to uncover. But you can find Bob at Austin Comic Con, Baltimore Comic Con, New York Comic Con, anything
Cincinnati.
Cincinnati. Okay. So, and I'll put every link below that's appropriate. And Bob, I super appreciate it. And as much as my motto is the West Coast Avengers, they're not as cool as the West Coast Avengers. It's a lie. It's a lie. You guys are much cooler than this guy here.
I don't know about that.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and appreciate it. And we'll talk again soon. Thank you
Great.
so much.
Thank you.
I hope you really enjoyed that chat with Bob Hall. It was a delight. We spent almost 2 hours talking. Got into some things pretty deep, but there's still so much to talk about his lengthy and historic career. I plan on chatting with Bob again. But if you want to explore some more of Bob's work, you can always Google it. You know, there's plenty of stuff to read. If you have a Marvel app, you can explore his Marvel work, or Comixology has a lot of different stuff. Down below is a link to his art rep, and you can click on the site and get commissions done by Bob. So that would be a great way to support him as well. I'm looking forward to the next time I get to speak to him, and I hope that you enjoyed this. Don't forget to do the thing.
Do it.
Check out the new podcast. It came from the newsstand. Links down below. And don't forget, I'll see you on Wednesday, or I'll see you in the funny pages. West Coast Avengers. All right, they're probably not as cool as the West Coast Avengers. What are you going to do?